Hello, sir. Can you hear us?
I can hear you, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, we've done it at last. Taken a long time.
Last.
So, I would like to start with a brief introduction for our audience. Sir Richard Overy is honorary history professor at the University of Exeter, one of the greatest experts on the Second World War, member of the British Academy and of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. Among other works, he published The Dictators, awarded with the Wolfstone History Prize in 2005, and Why the Allies Won, published in Italy by Il Mulino, with the title La Strada della Vittoria, The Road to Victory. Professor Overy, moreover, partook as expert in many documentaries, one of the most, which I remember, most famous of which is The World Wars, The World in Flames. And my very first encounter with you, with your work, Professor Overy, was when I read The Origins of the Second World War, a brief but intense book published in Italy by Il Mulino with the title Le origini della Seconda Guerra Mondiale. The book, while in the wake of Taylor's theory in the 70s analysis, what caused the Second World War under a new light, trying to give a foreground to long-term perspective on history. Today, we are going to present your latest work, a book that I truly enjoyed reading. I'd like to say a beautiful and thick, a huge work. Blood and Ruins, The Great Imperial War. 1931-1945, published in Italy by Einaudi, with the title Sangue e rovine, la Grande Guerra Imperiale, 1931-1945. But first, I would like to thank you, Sir Overy, for your kind availability. It is a real pleasure and honor to be able to have this conversation with you. And since I know you speak some Italian, grazie e benvenuto, professore.
Piacere.
È un piacere mio. So, let's go to the question for this interview. I'd like to start with the first one. The University of Exeter is probably ahead of its time with regard to a historiography of the empire. So just before tackling your work specifically, I would like to ask you, generally speaking, how did this new approach come to life? What are the conceptual premises of a historiography centered around the empire?
Well, I was very fortunate to be working at Exeter because it not only had a Centre for Imperial History, one of the first in the country, but also a Centre for the History of War, State and Society. Now it's the Centre for the Study of Violence. And I spent a lot of time attending the seminars and discussing imperial history with my colleagues. And for a long time, I'd worried that when we talk about the origins of the Second World War, we focus too much on Hitler and too much on Europe. What we needed much more was a global perspective. And that's what these imperial historians have. They have a proper global perspective. They think globally because the European Empire was a global enterprise. And that really began my interest in repositioning the Second World War at the end point of those 3 or 4 centuries of European colonial expansion. It seemed to me that it made more sense putting into that context rather than into a context derived just from the First World War.
Now, coming to your work, an eye-opening book which, judging by this width, surely required a huge deal of research, I would like to ask you, when and how have you come to the idea of writing Blood and Ruins, in which you propose a new chronology, 1931, 1945, and most importantly, a new definitory perspective, an imperial perspective?
Well, the imperial perspective, I think, is what prompted me to write the book in this way, because it seemed to me we can now think about the Second World War differently. It's not just European-centered, and it's not just about Germany, America, Britain, and so on. The Second World War, and also, of course, the First World War before it, were really global events. And to understand the Second World War, we need to understand the chronology better. It doesn't start in 1939. The situation of crisis in the world order begins in the early 1930s with the economic slump and then with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And the 1930s are a decade of growing violence and global instability. And it seemed to me that unless we factor in that decade and what's happening then, we can't really understand how war breaks out in 1939. And we can't really understand why Japan, Germany, and Italy become, the three Axis powers with an imperial perspective of their own. Now, it did take me a long time to write this book because I started writing it 9 years ago, 10 years ago, thinking of a more conventional history of the Second World War, going through, the usual story, the usual battles, and so on. And I thought, well, I can't do that. I've done it before in various forms. Well, not only can I not do that, but it didn't seem to me that it was any longer the best way of approaching the Second World War. Now we think in terms of global history. We think about networks and we think about exchanges between different regions of the world. We have to think of the Second World War in the context of a global crisis, and not just in the context of a crisis with Germany in Europe. So by a series of stages, if you like, I reached the point where I decided to recast the book entirely. I threw away what I'd written and started again about 6 or 7 years ago. And once I got the conception of how I wanted to approach the story, it became much easier to write it. So the writing only took 3 or 4 years.
Perfect. Some of the key concepts of your interpretation can be already seen in the prologue and your description. In particular, how the Second World War should be seen as deeply rooted in what Leonard Woolf would call in his Imperialism and Civilization a belligerent, crusading, conquering, exploiting, proselytizing civilization. On this base, you have argued the start of the First World War cannot just be pinpointed on a precise year, 1914. Now, if this were the case also for the Second World War, as your contribution demonstrates, could it be said that the war's storm had been brewing for quite long before breaking out? What are the founding characteristics of the civilization through itself in last dynamic impulse toward the empire? Does this apply only to the European continent, or could it be potentially extended to other areas of the world?
Well, part of the argument of my book, where my argument starts really, is that we need to look at the longer perspective. We need to look at the crisis that ends in the Second World War, the crisis of empire, as a crisis which emerges in the late 19th century. As European states, the United States, modernize rapidly, develop a more modern politics, the idea of the nation becomes much more important. And it seems to me that what really matters is that nationalism in the last third of the 19th century is increasingly expressed in terms of a European mission to civilize the world. It's more and more expressed in terms of empire as a way of defining the nation. And I've used the term in my book, nation empire. I think that's quite a good way of defining it. The more elites began to think about how do we define the nation, how do we build a proper consensus with the mass of the population. Well, one of the ways of doing it was by constructing an empire, and increasingly showing that empire was a sign of national maturity. Empire was a sign of a particular level of civilization, and so on and so on. All of this happened before 1914. The idea that some nation empire was a way to define the modern nation state. And this was something shared by Germany, Italy, and of course in Asia it was shared by Japan. It was very quickly decided that the way to become a great power was to do what Britain and France were doing, which was to build a territorial empire. And all of this didn't necessarily mean that the First and Second World War was inevitable. It wasn't. But what the empire building and the new nationalism did was to create an extraordinary level of disorder and instability in the world system. The middle of the 19th century wasn't like that. You had China, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had, Africa was then virtually unknown. By 1900, the old empires, China, the Ottoman Empire, in near crisis, going to collapse. New states have emerged, and Europe has set out to conquer all those parts of the world that have not yet been conquered. Now, in my view, this created an increasingly unstable world order. And it does seem to me that the First and Second World War was really about coping with that instability and its consequences. And in the end, a new stability was imposed after 1945 by the two superpowers, and empire was ended. That's why I see the Second World War as the end point, if you like, of a period of volatile and destabilizing empire building.
So in the book you state that in the time between the two wars there was no match between the reality and the imperial fantasies perceived by the most important and extended territorial empires, France and the UK, since, as Father explained, the empire was perceived as a means of security, of economic stability, while also mentioning other very important factor, the fascination that this concept will bring with itself. Fascinating to the point that having and maintaining an empire could in many ways result in excessive costs rather than an advantage. Why were the French and British empires so frail in the 20s?
I think I would answer that. I mean, the British and French empires were not frail. They faced all kinds of problems, and they were expensive to maintain. It meant keeping a constant military presence outside the country, as both France and the United Kingdom did. But I think for other empires, there certainly was a problem. The cost of building an empire, maintaining it, was greater than the advantages they derived from it. That was true of the Italian Empire, the German Empire, and increasingly the Japanese Empire too. Here, the rhetoric of empire, how important it is to us, how it helps build our national identity and so on, was very important. It was important too as a means to maintain political consensus at home, but as a means to strategic and economic advantage, it was much more limited. The exception, of course, is the British Empire, because it was huge, and Britain became rich on its empire. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain was the dominant world power, the dominant world trader, and that was a result of the British Empire. Britain gained enormous benefits from empire, but at the same time, by the 1920s and 1930s, what we see is the nationalism that's been developing in Europe is being exported now to the areas which the Europeans have conquered. In Korea, Britain, in Europe is being. You see national movements emerging, imitating the national movements in Europe. And that really does mean, in the long run, it's going to be very difficult to maintain territorial empires in that form.
Nonetheless, these imperial fantasies did in the end affect the three new international actors, Japan, Italy, Germany, that saw the empire perspective as the only way to save the nation. One novelty in this is undoubtedly the concept of empire not as a widespread network, but rather as a firm bloc aimed to grant territorial sovereignty to the nation. Would you please expand this for us?
What's interesting, I think, about German, Japanese, and Italian empire building in the 1930s is that it was rather different from the empire building that had gone on before 1914. In all three countries, all three deeply affected by the economic crisis in the late 1920s, early 1930s, they began to argue that if they were going to survive as a nation state and a powerful economy, they were going to need a territorial empire. That's what the British and the French had. The Americans had half a continent to fuel their economy. But what you needed was not overseas colonies difficult to defend. What you needed was a territorial bloc. And a territorial bloc could become independent of the world economy, would be less subject to threat. would provide markets, would provide resources, and so on. And this became a very popular idea in the 1920s, 1930s among a great many economists. The idea of block building. There was a sterling block, a franc block. It was assumed that the French and British had already done that. But the idea of a territorial block was that it would then be immune from attack. It would be immune, if possible, from the ups and downs of the world economy, and it would provide the necessary resource base to make you into a great power. And in Italy and in Germany and Japan, this idea of block building became paramount in the 1930s. The idea that somehow or other, if you could just dominate a Central European bloc, if you could dominate your Mediterranean North African bloc, if you could dominate East Asia and the Pacific, that would solve your problems. It would make you a powerful nation. You could compete with Britain and France, and it would secure your long-term economic interests.
So, in the wake of these later questions, it is fitting, I find, to consider the long-term effects that a historiography of the empire can have on the idea of empire itself. As provocative as it may sound, the cultural and political roots for both the Allied powers and the new international actors reach down much deeper than the rise to power of, respectively, the nationalists in Japan, the fascists in Italy, and the National Socialists in Germany, although these political factions certainly contributed in shaping it. When, and most importantly, how has the imperial culture in these three countries come to arise?
Well, you have to take this right back to the late 19th century. All three states developed as nation states very late, of course. Italy in 1860, 1870, Germany in 1870, Japan in 1868 with the refounding of the empire, the Meiji Restoration and so on. They were new arrivals on the international scene. And when they looked out at the empires that other countries possessed, they worried that they had arrived too late, I think, in the race. And so they set out in the 1880s, 90s, 1900s to try to see if they could build an empire as well, a territorial empire as well. But they got very little. Germany got some islands and some bits of Africa. Italy, well, not a great deal. And when Italy tried to expand into Abyssinia, of course, it failed. But nonetheless, they had this idea that somehow or other, a greater Italy or a greater Germany, or in the case of Japan, a greater Japan, would already be, the answer to their desire for great power status, and the advantages that they thought derived from being an imperial power. So yes, very deep roots. These were ambitions that continued to be frustrated. Germany was stripped of its colonies and told that it wasn't a decent imperial power, wouldn't get them back. Italy felt she'd got very little, of course, out of the First World War, and still thought about not just Mussolini, but other Italian nationalists thought about the idea of building a broader Italian empire. And the Japanese used the First World War to expand into China, and were then told by the Americans that they couldn't do that, resented it greatly. And by the 1920s, here were three dissatisfied powers that felt that they'd been cheated of some kind of imperial birthright, and at some point, they hoped that they would be able to build an empire. So it isn't just Hitler and Mussolini or the Japanese army. There is a much wider sense that these were three countries that deserved an empire, and yet they didn't have it.
Some historians have identified the start of the Second World War with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, other with the Spanish Civil War. Your chronology starts in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, although not as the start of the Second World War, but rather as the beginning of a new imperial era. How did this event influence the future crisis of the Society of Nations and in the broader strategic European and global context?
Well, I've used 1931 as my starting date, though you will see from what we've just been discussing that I think the roots, of course, go much further back. Because that was the first time that violence was used in the interwar period to begin a process of empire building. And it did signal a major change. The League of Nations, in the end, could do nothing about it. The Japanese government was a bit unhappy with what the army had done, but eventually they endorsed what the army had done, and increasingly saw expansion into China and East Asia as the answer to many of Japan's problems. So Manchuria was just the first stepping stone. Although most historians tend to ignore it, over the next 4 years, Japan continued to push into northern China, right down towards Beijing, dominating a larger and larger and larger area of East Asia, creating major instability in the region, and really opening the way to challenge the British and system operated through the League of Nations. It impressed Mussolini. It impressed Hitler. We know, more research has been done on that the Japanese invasion of Manchuria and Japanese ambitions aroused a great deal of interest in Europe. And, for Mussolini and then after 1933 for Hitler, the evidence that Japan could challenge the League of Nations and that Japan could embark on territorial empire building against a state that was a member of the League of Nations. China was a member of the League of Nations. It could embark on empire building at the expense of a member of the League of Nations. It was a signal to them that they might be able to do the same kind of thing.
Let us now come to Italy. During his arch, Mussolini's imperial project has seen some successes, the most notorious of which is the conquest of Ethiopia, while other plans were never fully carried out. Annex Malta, take Corsica and Tunisia from France, take control of the Suez Canal, Gibraltar and Cyprus, conquest Egypt and Sudan, and expand Italian territory in Yugoslavia and the Balkans. These were to be the outlines of a Mediterranean empire designed to be anti-British in concept. For the British had the fourth, from Mussolini's point of view, to hold the Italian people captive in pond with only two ways in and out, guarded by other powers. Thus, the need to take control of straits and expand in southeastern Europe. How much of this is to be dated back to the strategic that we saw and a geopolitical view conceptualized during the Italian Risorgimento? I remember Francesco Crispi. And how much of this is to be dated back to fascism? Did the Duce have a defined plan, or did he rather seize opportunities? Could you please tell us more about Mussolini's geopolitical view?
Well, I think it's certainly true that you can't just start with Mussolini. You have to go back to the late 19th century and the initial efforts to build an Italian empire. And, of course, the first effort against Abyssinia, which was a failure. But there was a strand in Italian international thinking going back to before the First World War, which saw Italy as a power that, if it wanted to be a great power, it would have to expand territorially. It would have to control other people and not just be satisfied with becoming a nation state on its own. And there were plenty of people around who could suggest the geopolitical future of Italy would have more than it had. And indeed, the First World War, one of the reasons Italy joined it, of course, was partly because it thought it would expand territorially afterwards at the expense of the Central Powers, or that it would benefit from the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. And it got very little. And Mussolini in the 1920s really gives voice to a wider resentment among nationalist forces in Italy, that somehow or other Italy was always regarded as second rate. It was it wasn't in the top league, and it wouldn't be in the top league because it didn't have an empire. And this idea that somehow or other to become a major power, to join, if you like, the top league, you needed a territorial empire. It was something that Mussolini and others carried with them. They couldn't do much about it in the 1920s, of course. They were hemmed in. They were trying to establish political power inside Italy and so on. But by the time of Manchuria and the Japanese challenge to the League, I think Mussolini had come to realize that it was possible to go further. In fact, necessary to go further. If he was to fulfill the promise of fascism, it would create a wonderful Italian future. And from that point on, of course, imperialism becomes associated very closely with the dictator, with Mussolini's ambitions. And Mussolini was a fantasist. I mean, he looked at the map of the world, he looked at the bits he thought Italy ought to control, and took very little notice of international realities. Of course, in the end, he had to face up to those realities. He couldn't take Malta away from the British, for example. And you couldn't hope to conquer Egypt and Sudan and so on. But what he mapped out, I think, was what we might call a fantasy empire, just imagining what Italy would be like if it had all of that area, the Eastern Mediterranean, Eastern and Northern Africa. And it was only, of course, under the wing of Hitler's Germany, when France was defeated, that it was possible for Mussolini to move further. Not very successfully, of course. But still, the dream was somehow or other that you carve out this larger area in the Mediterranean and Africa, which would be the Italian empire, the Italian bloc, and challenge or indeed overturn the British and French empires that had hemmed Mussolini in. It's a curious, I mean, you look back at it, it's a curious set of ambitions because it is unrealistic. Italy is not a major power militarily. And indeed, Mussolini doesn't put the resources in necessary to become that great imperial power. Contrast with Hitler's Germany, where the priority from 1933 is rearmament on a massive scale. Nothing like that happens in Mussolini's Italy. So there is always a gap between imagination and reality. But the roots of this go way back. It's not just Mussolini.
So now coming to Germany instead, you have underlined how the efficiency of colonial administration was a theme brought up by the British, the French, as well as by the Germans to justify other colonial actions, but also to discredit each other's enemies and lower their international credibility. Apart from racism and the idea of there being superior and inferior culture and peoples, all ideas present in different gradations within all the main powers, I believe a really defining feature was the technical capability to create an economic and administrative space. Just this capacity of itself. In fact, you also underline in the book how Hitler had a merely economic view of the empire, being perfectly aware of this long-term legacy, which dated back, among other, to the first Lebensraum conceptualization by Ratzel. How have you come to this idea? What were Weimar Germany's colonial projects, and from 1933, those of Nazi Germany?
Well, like Italy, I think we need to look at Germany's ideas about empire going right back to the 19th century. And there were plenty of people around the late 19th century writing about German empire, the need for colonies. But as many German historians have argued in recent years, what's more important is that Germany is looking east. There are a great many Germans who think that the natural area for German expansion is going to be into Eastern Europe, even into Tsarist Russia, and that this makes much more sense for Germany than having colonies overseas, which they can't defend very easily, and which don't provide them with very much. So this idea that somehow or other an integrated economic political space is what the Germans needed, more space, takes root before the First World War. And Hitler picks it up in the early 1920s. It's something which is, it's a discourse widespread in Germany, the need for space, the need, to preserve the economy by engrossing resources and markets. And Hitler swallows this almost entirely. And in his so-called second book, not published, written in 1928, never published, he explores this much more. Really, the answer to the economic future of Germany is, in the end, you're going to have to make war. You're going to have to conquer empire. And if you conquer empire, then you not only demonstrate the virility of the German people, the German nation, and the superiority of its culture, but you also secure its economic future. And Hitler has a very economic conception of empire. We see it. There's one just very interesting example, I'll quote. In 1941, with the Barbarossa invasion of the Soviet Union, the armed forces, Hitler's commanders they're focused on defeating the Red Army. For them, Clausewitz, the lessons of Clausewitz is that you defeat the armed forces of the enemy, then you can decide other things. Hitler is much more interested in seizing Soviet economic resources, moving south into the Ukraine, moving towards the oil and so on. And it creates a tension between Hitler and his commanders, which goes on into 1942. I think that's an interesting example of the extent to which Hitler's conception of territorial empire is indeed a very economic one.
The new powers' common interest in doing away with the Geneva Old Ladies or the Allies become self-evident at the moment of signature of the Tripartite Act. It is interesting to notice, have you ever underlined, the haste and urgency with which it all came to be, evident in the choice of the English language, for the translation, to avoid all potential problems with Japanese. According to you, what might have caused this sense of improvisation, of hurry? Maybe the war had to be won quickly before the USA and USSR could become even more frightful for the Axis.
The Tripartite Pact, or Three-Power Pact, I call it, which is the proper translation, it's an unusual agreement because, in fact, the Italians and the Japanese and Germans don't collaborate a great deal, either before or afterwards. But they make a statement, and it's a statement directed principally at the United States. Basically, keep out of Europe, keep out of Asia. And they make it at that point because Japan is already facing problems with the United States as it expands further and further into China. Germany has now dominated Europe, continental Europe, and is thinking now of a new geopolitical future, which can be shared with the Japanese and the Italians. And so this is decided on at rather short notice as a symbolic statement. It's a statement saying, we are the three new powers, we are the three new imperial powers. These are our imperial interests, and the rest of you keep out. Now, if they collaborated more effectively, the war might well have taken a rather different turn, but they didn't. The Tripartite Pact is the high point, really, at which the three powers come together and make a common statement about their view of geopolitics.
So, on to the last two main powers, the real victors of the war, I would like you to help us contextualize a little more precisely regarding their involvement in the conflict. On the other hand, the US interests coming from that phase known as isolationism, and on the other, Stalin's pragmatic imperial plans. A very specific example of this pragmatism is when, as you have recalled, Stalin and Molotov had declared themselves ready to negotiate with the Axis in exchange of massive territorial concessions and guarantees. Hitler, though, thought that a defeated USSR would have allowed them to channel their forces against the UK and was thus not interested in taming the Soviet dictator. Has this non-alliance changed the course of the conflict? Can we speak of the imperial ambitions of the USA and USSR as well? If so, what were those and which ones did they manage to achieve?
Well, this is a very big question. To take the first part, there's no doubt that even in Hitler's mind too, I think, there was briefly the idea in 1939, 40, 41 that you could remake the world by collaborating with the Soviet Union and breaking Anglo-American power. If you could do that, Italy, Japan, the Soviet Union, Germany, you might remake the world and achieve what you want. But Hitler, of course, is fiercely anti-Marxist. And I think in the long run, for him, it really is very difficult to bridge that ideological divide between Stalin's communism and Hitler's National Socialism. Not only that, but Hitler also understands that he will get economic help from the Soviet Union. But what he really wants is territory. He wants land, he wants resources for the German people. And the defeat of France, and that's the point, at that point, the defeat of France suddenly opens up for Hitler the idea that you can actually now go out and seize these resources rather than trying to reach some sort of agreement with Stalin. Now, if he hadn't decided that, and had decided to continue to collaborate, which Stalin was perfectly happy with, if that might well have been a major, change of the way in which the war situation unraveled, because then Germany would be free to try and defeat the United Kingdom in 1941, continue to collaborate with Stalin and take resources, build basically a German bloc in Europe, which the Americans could do very little about. But it's an unrealistic scenario because, of course, for Hitler, the worrying thing is communism moving westwards rather into Eastern Europe. For him, the worrying thing is that this is a system which is dominated by communists and Jews. And, in the long run, he won't get the Lebensraum he's looking for if he's going to have to collaborate and argue and negotiate with the Soviet Union on that frontier in Eastern Europe. So for Hitler, it seems to me his strategy is simplified by saying to himself, all right, I'll knock the Soviet Union out in one big blow. I'll take all their resources and land, and then I'll turn around and there's nothing that the British and Americans can do about it. And in the end, that's the strategic profile that he adopts late in 1940. When it comes to the question of American and Soviet imperialism, I think this is a complicated one. I've had many criticisms from people saying, well, after the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union imperial powers in the sense in which I've been talking about them. Those European powers in Japan but adopted a view of territorial conquest and subjection. America and the Soviet Union were hegemonic powers. What Stalin wanted was to expand communism, not to build colonies. And that was his priority. The more the world would become communist. The United States, its priority was that the world shouldn't become communist. And it extended its military power across the globe in order to try and prevent that from happening. But they were not states that were building old-fashioned territorial empires. Now, we can play with words and call it empire if you want to, but it doesn't seem to me very useful. I prefer to see America and the Soviet Union, and now, of course, China, as hegemonic powers, exercising hegemony without actually having to take territories over. Military hegemony, economic hegemony, and so on. They can get other states to do what they want, but they don't turn them into colonies. And for me, that's a fundamental difference between the 300 or 400 years before 1945 and the 80 years we've had since.
So we have talked about the similarities and differences between the two blocks. If you were to name some frailties within each block, which ones would you underline? One of the examples you have put in the spotlight on is the visits Hitler pays in Italy, Spain and France to meet with their respective leaders, trying to find common ground for a better coordination in the conflict, that however were not to encounter success. When and how more specifically did the Allied ever found themselves in a similar situation?
Well, the example you've cited there is an interesting one because Hitler was a hopeless diplomat, and diplomacy was not what he was interested in doing. He was interested in telling people what to do. Um,
Of course.
and it was Ribbentrop's idea, really, that somehow or other, his foreign minister's idea, that somehow or other you could build some kind of bloc there, including Russia, which would defeat Britain. But Hitler was always half-hearted about it, and it had little chance of success. If I point to a real frailty of the Axis powers, it really was their failure to collaborate or coordinate what they were doing. Now, some historians recently have begun to argue that there was more of an Axis network than we had previously thought, and they are highlighting economic collaboration and so on, technical collaboration between them. The establishment after the Three Power Pact of 1940, the establishment of a regular committee system in each capital, in Berlin, in Tokyo, in Rome, where representatives from each of the three Axis powers would meet and discuss questions about military collaboration and so on and so on. But it was extremely ineffective. Hitler didn't tell Mussolini he was going to invade the Soviet Union. Mussolini didn't tell Hitler he was going to invade Greece. And the Japanese told nobody. Now, if you're going to coordinate your strategy, you need to have some sense of what it is that you're and I think there's no doubt that if they had collaborated and coordinated, they might have achieved a great deal more than simply by acting on their own. Now, the assumption, of course, is that the Western allies and the Soviet Union were a much more effective alliance. Now, we know, of course, that there were all kinds of strains and difficulties between the three states. The Soviet Union distrusted Britain and the United States. In Britain and the United States, there were strong anti-communist lobbies. They tried to coordinate strategy, but it often failed. The failure to provide a second front for Stalin in 1942 or 1943, for example. And yet, they did cling together throughout the war with a single ambition of defeating the Axis states, and in particular, a single ambition of defeating Hitler. And it was that bound them together. If they had not been all three intent on defeating Hitler as the precondition for building a better world or a different world, then their collaboration might well have fallen apart as well. So the big difference between the two blocs is, the Axis don't collaborate, and in the end, the three Allied powers do collaborate, not well, but they do collaborate. Now, if we're looking at strengths and weaknesses, one of the other factors I think we might focus on is economic. That Germany is a rich and successful industrial economy. Italy and Japan are not. Germany could have shared more of its resources and technical and scientific knowledge with both the Japanese and the Italians, but they don't. On the other hand, the United States initiates in 1941 a quite extraordinary program of economic and military assistance for the other allies, Lend-Lease. And Lend-Lease is a program on a colossal scale. Germany couldn't have done that. Obviously, it's not the United States. But Lend-Lease enormously helps the British and Soviet war effort. In fact, without Lend-Lease, the Soviet and British war effort would have been much less successful. Now, if the Germans had, thought about sharing the resources of continental Europe more fully with their allies, again, perhaps more might have been achieved. I would give one good example, one small example. The Italians didn't have radar, had very limited radar. They asked the Germans if they would provide them with some radar sets. As the Allies built up their air power in the Mediterranean. And the Germans refused at first, and then Telefunken, the German company producing the radar sets, said they would send some radar sets, but they could only be operated by Germans. And that's, in fact, what Italian radar was in 1942 and 43. It was set up by the Germans and operated by the Germans. Their interest in helping the Italian Air Force was minimal. Now, that's an extraordinary contrast. Why? Why not help the Italian Air Force? No, you're fighting a common enemy. In the United States, there was a whole lot of disquiet about the British and their imperialism, a whole lot of anxiety about Stalin and his communism. But in the end, the American government and military provided a huge amount of aid to their allies without really questioning it. The one exception was the development of atomic weapons, because the United States decided not to share that with its allies, even with Britain. But with that one exception, the United States provided the sinews of war for the other allied powers. And I think that, if we're looking at a major difference between the two blocks, I think that's a very important one.
In your cited work, The Origins of the Second World War, you have posed an important question on the responsibilities of the war, a question that can be summarized with was Hitler's war? Is this still your view of things? In the present work, you have posed two more questions, just or unjust wars. Would you please expand on this for us?
Well, these are two questions, really. I'll start with the first one. When I wrote Origins of the Second World War many years ago, I started out from the premise that we need to understand that the war was declared by Britain and France, not by Germany. Germany, of course, attacked Poland, and Hitler wanted a local war against Poland and hoped that it would remain localized. It would be his Ethiopia, his Manchuria. But the Western powers didn't. They decided that they would declare war. And that means you've got to ask a lot of questions about what's going on in Britain and France, not just what's going on in Germany. Of course, the invasion of Poland was Hitler's responsibility alone, and the British and the French reacted to it. But it's a much more complicated question than that. Hitler hoped he would get away with it, and he doesn't. The British and French had hoped that he would see sense or be deterred, but he wasn't. And the failure to deter him meant that they had no alternative but to declare war. When they declared war, the war immediately became a world war, because Britain and the British Empire stretched from Europe to Australia to Canada to the Pacific. The French, too, when they declared war, they were declaring war on behalf of North Africa, of Vietnam, of a string of island colonies. So the war immediately became globalized. And I think we need to always keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that the British and the French are responsible for the Second World War, but it became the Second World War because of their own decision that this was the point at which they were going to obstruct Axis expansion. They didn't do it with Japan. They thought about it with Italy, but didn't do it. They thought about it again in 1938 with Czechoslovakia. By 1939, they decided there was a limit. And it's a limit not just to Germany, in fact. The British and the French are thinking about, what do we do in Asia? What do we do in the Middle East? What do we do in Africa? What do we do in Europe? And the immediate crisis is Poland. But they're very aware that this is only part of a global crisis, and they've got to try and respond to it as best they can. In the end, the decision they made was disastrous. France is defeated, Britain is pushed out of Europe, and the Axis become temporarily dominant. But that's not what the British and French declared war for. They thought that this was a war they would win, as they'd won the First World War. They would bottle Germany up, they would blockade Germany, they would wear her down by bombing, and then the Germans would surrender. And a more fantastic strategic miscalculation, it's hard to imagine. Now, the second part of your question, just or unjust wars, again, this is rather a provocative title. And I chose it really because it's just to remind people that, in the World War, fought with this intensity, fought for very real ideals, you're going to stretch, if you like, the morality of war um, further and further until you end up, or the Allies end up, for example, doing things that we would not regard as very moral. Now, there's never been any doubt about how wicked the Italians and the Germans and the Japanese are, and so on. But I wanted people really to just think about what war does. And I took a number of examples. One of them was anti-Semitism, of course. Anti-Semitism was widespread in Britain and the United States. It inhibited any effort to save Jews in the late 1930s, and again, in the early stages of the Second World War. Not just that, but the British and the Americans took policy decisions which actually contributed to making the Jewish situation worse. And that's, for many people reading this book, I found out this was a shock. They had no idea that, that there was if you like, an allied dimension to the Jewish crisis, not just all to do with Hitler. There are other examples one could point out too. The racism of the two major allies, Britain and the Empire, the United States against its own black population, and so on. So, in other words, it's a war that had to be won, of course, against Japanese militarism, German and Italian fascism. It had to be won, but we need to remind ourselves that in trying to win it, you also cross some thresholds and do things that you wouldn't otherwise have done. Dropping the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is perhaps the best example. It's a horrific thing to have done, deliberately to drop an atomic bomb, knowing what it would do on a civilian population. But for the Americans, they never really felt inhibited by that. And it seemed to me to symbolize the extent to which waging world war for one's own survival makes it possible for you to do almost anything.
So did you answer the next? War, in fact, has left behind nations shattered to pieces and a torn apart continent. We have been talking about strategy, and we'll go back to that in the last question. However, a dramatically decisive role in the legacy of this war is certainly played by the countless atrocities and war crimes that were committed, analyzing which we have talked about emotional geography of the war. What do you mean by this definition? How have you tackled this phenomenon as a historian?
Well, these are, two rather separate questions, I think. There are 2 chapters in the book, one about emotional geography of war, one about atrocities.
Yeah.
Yes. What I really wanted to do was to look at the history of the war, not just as a history of battles and production or politics, but war does things, particularly a war of this intensity and scale, does terrible things to the people who are involved in it. 100 million people are in uniform. They're mostly civilians who are suddenly put into the front line and told they've got to bomb people, blow them to bits, stick bayonets in them, and so on, and do things they would never normally have done or thought of doing. And this exacts an extraordinary emotional toll of the people who are involved in it. And I wanted really to remind readers that, war is not just, a story of heroes and excitement. The war is a grimy, difficult, often atrocious activity in which people can become completely disorientated by their experience, as we can see, of course, in the wars that are being waged at the moment. What it also did, I think, was to encourage growing levels of atrocity that in quite a number of contexts, troops got out of control. Japanese troops in China, for example, German troops in the Soviet Union. They found themselves constantly harassed by guerrillas, by the threat of the local population, and they took it out on the local population. The German case took it out on Jews because they assumed the Jews were the main culprits. And so what you get is a terrible descent to a spiral of atrocity and violence. of a terrible kind of the Second World War. And I focus quite a lot on atrocities committed against women, for example, which again you will not find in very many general histories of the Second World War. But the role of women as victims of atrocity, and the role of women, of course, in trying to cope with the emotional strain of war, it is a very important dimension of the story, and we don't understand the whole war unless we include these things as well. Well, example I use at length in the book are the Japanese comfort women, where Japanese soldiers, routinely captured and raped women in China, in Korea, in Southeast Asia, often on a colossal scale. Horrifying experience for the women that became the victims. Now, for a long time, it was denied, or it was relativized, wasn't that important, and so on. More important to focus on the war and what's going on in the war. But it's an integral part of the war. The Japanese army had few controls of what it was doing and how it behaved. And in China, it just set up these brothels where they forced Chinese women to have sex, and thought nothing of it. So there's a terrible sense in the war in which atrocity becomes perpetrated routinely. People begin to see it as normal. German soldiers in the Soviet Union, who back home would be, in many cases, perfectly decent people, but didn't find any difficulty in burning a village down and murdering its inhabitants, or herding people into a local barn and setting it on fire. Now, if we're to understand the Second World War, or more broadly, if we're to understand what war does to people, these are very important perspectives on the war, and I've made no concessions. I put them in to remind people that war is this. It's about geopolitics, about fighting, and so on. But it's actually also about the damage it does to people.
The final chapter is again dedicated to the topic of the empire that would soon become nation. Has the outcome of this war entirely determined this path, or was this long-term process started with the end of the First World War that will inevitably, or perhaps very likely, to end up the way it did?
Well, it's a very very good question. Yes, of course, it had longer roots. And much of the best imperial history is being done on decolonization and so on. And again, it looks back really even before the First World War, but particularly, of course, at the end of the First World War and the immediate aftermath, where colonized peoples wanted to be independent. They didn't want to be colonized. They didn't want to be subjects of the crown or subjects of France. And the Second World War is important because it accelerates that process. It's not just a catalyst, as some people suggest. It accelerates that process. It makes it almost impossible for the older imperial powers to come back and say, well, we spent 6 years defeating Japanese, Italian, and German imperialism, but do you mind if we keep ours? And the answer, of course, for people in India and Vietnam and in the Middle East and so on, the answer was no. We don't want you any longer to have an empire. We fought for you during this war, but we fought partly because we see this as a means to our own liberation. India is the best example. But yes, the routes are longer, but very little had been achieved, very little by 1939. By 1945, the conditions have been created where the older empires are going to dissolve. And they do, the British Empire very quickly, the French Empire in terrible violence in Vietnam and Algeria, the Belgian Empire by the time the Congo becomes independent, the Dutch Empire by the late 1940s. They don't go without a struggle, and there's a lot of imperial violence in the years after 1945. The end of the war doesn't bring the end to the violence. But in the end, it's, old-fashioned territorial empire is insupportable after 1945. You can't keep it going. And neither the Soviet Union nor the United States, the superpowers, were really willing to endorse it. And so I see the Second World War as not just a catalyst, but I see the Second World War as providing the occasion for that geopolitical transformation.
So, what legacy have empires left behind in contemporary history? Do you think that empires are now a definitely surpassed concept, or do you think in this period of wars it might come to a new rise in the wake of the new geopolitical struggles?
Well, people often ask me whether there's going to be, renewed imperialism. I mean, I think that this is really belongs to a particular period. 300 or 400 years as Europe expanded and defeated the cultures and civilizations of other parts of the world. That was a particular stage of history. No, you may well get in the next century efforts by major powers to dominate others, but I don't think they're going to colonize them or turn their populations into subjects. There are, going to be all kinds of geopolitical problems in the coming century. Nobody would pretend that there wouldn't be. But I don't think we will return to the 1930s, except in one sense that people talk now of the 2020s as the 1930s. We're in a renewed period of major instability. Now, that is true, but the roots of that instability are different from the roots of that instability in the 1930s. And I think that we should not confuse the two. I think that empire, as it finished in the 1940s and 50s, was the end point of a particular stage of history. I think what happens in the 21st century will be different.
So, Overy, we would like to thank you for your competence and for sharing with us in this occasion. Thank you, really, sir.
Thank you.